Hi, everyone. Just letting everyone settle in. We'll get started in about 2 minutes.
Thanks for dropping by, everybody. We've got about a minute and a half here. We'll go ahead and get started. We just want to give everybody a little chance to file in here.
All right, maybe give folks about another minute or so, and then we'll get started.
Okay, just about ready to get started here. Just letting a few of those stragglers to kind of come in there. So.
All right. Well, I think we're ready to get started here. Give folks some time to come in. So thanks everyone for joining us today. We're really excited to put on this webinar for you. Couple of quick intros to start. My name's Ava Raganese. I'm based out of our Jersey City office here at AvePoint. I'm on our product marketing team, leading a lot of the go-to-market for Google and our multi-cloud solutions of the platform. And yeah, I went to Google Cloud Next in April and have been energized ever since as we expand more into the Google ecosystem.
And I'm Shane Donahue. I'm a senior solutions engineer here out of Los Angeles, California. Not only that, I'm a certified Google professional collaboration engineer, and I've been supporting, administrating, migrating, you name it, for the Google Workspace platform since it was Google Apps for Enterprise. So if you want to go Google that, you'll see how long I've been around for.
Seen it all. All right, so really excited today, jam-packed webinar for you guys, but for about the next hour or so, we really want to dive into a couple of key things here, starting with the importance of unstructured data security and a lot of customers that we've been talking to, how this is shifting in the market, especially because of AI. So that'll dive us into a great walkthrough from Shane about the steps to secure data in Google Workspace, as that data is fueling AI and Gemini specifically. So we'll get into, why for Gemini adoption, internal security is more important than ever. And then lastly, kind of tie it off with as you're scaling your AI initiatives, how to maintain that trust at scale. So before we dive into some of the webinar content, just wanted to share out an ebook that we recently just co-authored. So the QR code here is for folks to scan. So, as we continue to support our customers, their multi-cloud and protecting the data that fuels Gemini or Copilot or any other AI assistant is really critical. So as we've been helping organizations overcome these challenges, whether it's security, governance, compliance, we've been around here and want to share some of those steps that we've put together. So take a look at this ebook. All right, so let's get into it. So at AvePoint, we've been using Gemini, and a lot of the customers that we talk to, we've been seeing the same three key themes of why Gemini has been so powerful and so impactful for so many organizations. So first being, I think the most obvious, that it's so accessible, right? There's no barrier to entry when it comes to licensing, who has access to what. So it's really great to get folks started with AI, and the integrations are really seamless. So in the walkthroughs, we'll talk about what those integrations look like from a security and administrative standpoint. But from the end user standpoint, it's really great. And especially the Notebook LM tool as well. Being on our product strategy team here at AvePoint, I can speak firsthand that Notebook LM has really been a game changer for us, especially when it comes to a lot of the research that we're conducting ourselves. And then lastly, it's safe, right? We can't have this risk management webinar without talking about how safe Gemini is and all the certifications that it has. These are just a few to name. So as we talk about Gemini and just Gen AI adoption initiatives in general, we've noticed an increased risk in the data exposure, and there's just larger attack surfaces out there when it comes to unstructured data. So what it's been forcing leaders is to think more strategic, especially when it comes to the sensitive data that lives in their organization. And why unstructured data? Well, it's the most valuable and it's also the most risk. So the statistic here from Gartner, it's honestly a warning and an indicator of where focus for data security needs to be, right? For years, it's been on unstructured data, for years it's been on structured data, right? CRM systems, financial records, databases, all of that. And while that's really critical, there are well-established protocols for that. But when it comes to unstructured data, which is, your meeting notes, your drafted summaries, all of the things that you're doing day to day, it has the most value that we want AI to kind of tap into, but it also has the most risk and a lot of vulnerabilities. So for instance, when we talk to customers every day, recently a customer came forward and they were deploying and running Gemini for most of their organization, but there was an employee that one day, they're just trying to get started on drafting a strategy document, right? Hey, Gemini, can you reason over my department meeting history, sprint planning documents, deliverables, everything, right? And what it returned was actually a budget planning sheet that was confidential. So Gemini, of course, goes off of only the data that you have permissions for. But in the case of this employee, at this customer we were talking to, they actually switched departments from the financial team. So in that department switch was a whole slew of permissions that they didn't realize that they still had access to. And this happens every day. And, unfortunately, it's a situation that can cause a massive data breach. Now, they should have never had access to the document in the first place, but, this is something that happens a lot when folks don't understand or even know that some of their permissions have been misconfigured. So it kind of goes back to, as organizations are scaling these Gen AI initiatives, the focus needs to be on what data is getting consumed and processed and reasoned over, because stuff like this can't afford to happen. So as we talk about how to secure that unstructured data, like I mentioned, Shane's going to do a little bit of a walkthrough today of what's offered natively in Google Workspace. So Shane, I'll pass it on to you to talk first about what's built in with Gemini and how folks can manage that, user access and integrations. Oh, Shane, I think your mic might be muted by accident.
Whoops! Forgot to pray to the demo gods today. My bad. So, okay. So what we're looking at here is the Gemini web interface here. This is kind of the core for the end user access point for accessing Gemini and getting any utility or usefulness out of this. So what we want to do here is just kind of start with showing you what the integrations look like. So from the end user side of things, if I go to settings and help, and I go ahead and say apps, I can see what integrates with Gemini on my end of things. Now, the reason it's my end of things is because I might be able to attach certain other tools to this. So for instance, GitHub is available as a productivity add-on that I can potentially reference. But what we're really looking at here is the workspace side of things. So in the workspace, I get a big on-off switch. If I turn it on, this is my first time turning it on, or when I turn it back on, I get a really nice big warning here that says, look, this is content is not used to improve Gemini. We're not feeding any of this into the bigger model. Gemini is secure as long as you're on this workspace level here. So I'll just call that out there. It's a little separate licensing. So if you're over on the consumer side, it's a little bit different experience on that side of front. So, but we're dealing with workspace. So with that, we're going to go ahead and connect that. But when we're looking at this, you'll see that we get a really nice base summary here. We get calendar, docs, drive, keep, tasks. So we're going to start with looking at drive. And if I hit the learn more, I get a really nice summary from Google. I know what's kind of happening within my environment here. So just really quickly, using Drive, Gemini can retrieve docs or PDFs based on the description of its contents or mentioning tiles and author sender. So that means Gemini's in there. It's going to be doing its indexing thing. Like a lot of the Google search indexing is happening within your Drive environment already. But we're also able to pull information out of that on a more direct basis. So we can summarize, get information, and ask questions. So it's adding that context to that. It's also good to tell you what it can't do, which is it can't create drafts or delete any sheets. It can't count items for you in your Drive. It can't answer prompts about images or PDFs or anything like that, retrieve slides, or manage your Drive data and clean things up, which is probably the biggest feature that I wish I had, because unstructured data is probably the definition for my entire Drive existence. Google makes it so easy to search that filing things is not really how I keep my data around. And I know there's a lot of people in there with me on that one. Switching over to the doc side of things, we get a little bit different story here just because we're getting integrated with the actual docs platform or the docs application there. So in this case, we can retrieve documents based on descriptions, titles, and author. We can also find information and ask questions about content. So the difference here is that while I can certainly search a docx or a PowerPoint or anything like that that's uploaded to my Drive, that this is going to be a little bit more ingrained because it's the whole Google Apps backend with all the revision history and changing and that. So it's just a little bit more detailed capacity there. And again, the same story is can't create, draft, or delete, manage docs, process or respond to large files, or attach attachments. So pretty straightforward. If you do want to play with this, I do recommend there's some really cool prompts to try under each one of these. So go ahead and click one of those and have yourself a little tour of Gemini. But that's not where we're going here today. We're talking about what it looks like to administer this. So from the end user side of things, they can turn on and off access to Workspace stuff. You can do a fairly similar thing here. So let's go ahead and go to the admin console. Hopefully you're familiar with this. We're going to see a little bit of it here in this panel here. And in this case, we're going to look at the Gemini controls. So they neatly tuck them all under generative AI. And the first one on the list is just Gemini app. Gemini app control basically turns on or off Gemini entirely, regardless of license. And what that means is that if you are a Workspace user, if you're on the enterprise licensing and stuff that comes with a Gemini app, you are going to go ahead and potentially get access to this. But if you don't have a Gemini license, something that's carrying like Gemini Pro or better is bundled in with it, you're going to be looking at wanting to potentially restrict this, because this means that users would be using consumer Gemini. Remember how we had that warning that popped up about how your Workspace data controls keeps everything separate? That's a little less true when you get over on the consumer side of things. So users can still use all the consumer tools that Google gives access to with their Workspace accounts, you know, YouTube, Maps, etc. But this is going to go ahead and separate that, make sure that users are not using something that might be contributing to the larger model and stuff. We don't want any sort of data leakage that way. So definitely check that control. I'm also going to point out that this is available on a per OU, per group, and per user basis. So pretty straightforward there, where you can control who's got access to what when it comes to that feature set. If I go ahead and back up here, you're going to see I have a Gemini for Workspace button on the left column here. And that's where I can go ahead and dig into something like feature access. So I can go ahead and turn on Drive and Docs, Gmail, Chat, and Meet. So those tiles that we had inside the Gemini controls there on the end user side, well, this is where I can kind of administratively turn those on or off if a user has access to Workspace. There's also a greater tool set to turn on and off Workspace controls entirely for those more Workspace built-in additions. So doc formatting help, doc construction help me build, do the spreadsheet map and all that sort of stuff. There's another switch for that here under the Gemini app there. But these are kind of the core features that we're looking at for Gemini controls to make sure that we are making sure that Gemini is only accessing the type of data that we're looking for. But as you can see here, these are hammer controls. They're not scalpel controls. I can turn them on and off for certain users, but it's all in or all out. So Drive and Docs entirely. There's no middle ground where I can say, okay, only access shared drives or only access this specific content. So that's where some of these can get a little challenging here, because maybe you don't have a problem with AI as much as you have a problem with some of the permissioning in your content that then feeds the AI. So with that,
yeah, I mean, that was a great walkthrough of what's built in with Gemini, right? So if we flip back over, there is the aspect that you just talked about when it comes to what is the data that's actually fueling Gemini, right? So what's all the stuff in the admin panel that folks can have control over when it comes to all that data that's in Workspace, all that unstructured data? Let's walk through that next.
For sure. So let me go ahead and turn that present back on. And in this case, we're going to go ahead and wander over to Google's sharing permission side of things. So over here under apps, I can go into Google Workspace, and we're going to be looking at Drive and Docs. So what kind of controls do I have kind of top down administratively here to regulate my documents or my content and how that gets shared? So you'll see under Drive and Docs, I have a really big bar that says sharing settings. Pretty straightforward on that one. Again, this is available on a per user, per group, or per OU basis, so you can dial in exactly who's getting subject to what controls, but really the big one we're looking at here is sharing options. So if I scroll down here a little bit, so it's in frame, I'm looking at kind of most open at the bottom to most closed at the top. On the bottom, on files owned by users and shared drives in AvePoint, in our case, our AvePoint tenant here, can be shared outside of our tenant. We can get some warnings. We can say whether or not we want to share with people who aren't using Google accounts, so we can really open that up. That's a lot of sharing. That's a lot of external sharing. Maybe we want to back that one down. So a lot of orgs will set, say, an allowed listed domains. So if we're working with, a government or a business or enterprise or something that also has Workspace, we can go ahead and add them to our allowed domain list and say, like, everybody can share with these people. We trust them. We know who we're working with here. There's no surprises, so we can't share with, say, an @Gmail account. Pretty straightforward listing on that one. Then the last one here is just completely turning off sharing. Now, this one's more aligned or akin to a situation where maybe you've got some frontline workers, very popular in retail, where you don't have a real good reason where these users need to share externally functionally at all. It's entirely internal. So we may apply that for a subset or as our base permission, and then start to break up our permissions a little higher up the chain of, now your middleware worker, you're going to be a little bit more on the allow listed side, and then your top level, say marketing and stuff, who's got to work with everybody and all the crazy people across the board, might get a little bit different permission set there. So the big point out with this list here, though, is that all of these permissions are about external sharing. None of this controls or regulates or talks about internal sharing whatsoever. Well, what can we do to at least kind of start to identify stuff internally or start to recognize what we have going on inside of our data set here? And that is where we're going to pivot over to another tool that Google makes available called classification labels. So if I go ahead here and head down to the security section, and I'm going to go ahead and hit my access and data controls, and we're going to look at a label manager to start with. So we've got a couple of labels that we've already built out for our tenant here. I'm going to go ahead and just dive in on AvePoint sensitivity as our example here, but you can see that we also have a subset for department. So we can certainly set different options for usages of these labels. Now, in our use case, what we're looking at here is just a really simple sensitivity labeling basis. So we'll be feeding that into some other mechanisms that I'll show you in just a bit here. But the core of it is that I want to go ahead and set up a method that I can apply a label that establishes the sensitivity level of the content of a document. So I have my low, medium, and high, very, very simple label set here. I have a few controls that are available here as well. So I can say permissioning. Right now, this is set so that anybody can view, apply, edit labels, etc. So we're opening this up, so allowing end users to participate in this end labeling process here. I can set this where it's a view-only label so that they can see the label is applied to a document and what the rating is. Then I can allow certain groups of users to specifically do that permissioning or do that label application there. But this is all just the usage of the label, not necessarily the content or changing access to the content with this. The last one is restricted access, where it just makes the label basically completely invisible, and we're applying that on the back end for our administrative uses purposely only. And you get a little idea of what it looks like here in a document with this fun little drop down here, and that's kind of what that's going to look like. So we can add descriptions and anything that we need to kind of help build this out as we go through this here to apply this. There is one more cool feature that's available for our Enterprise Plus users or people that have AI specific licensing, and that is under our expansion here where we have security and access control. And then under that, we're going to be looking at data classification. So this is a new tool set available from Google. If you guys haven't dug into this one at all, it's super, super nerdy and cool. But basically what this lets you do is set up training labels where you can go ahead and apply a training label to specific documents. And then that is going to use Gemini on the back end to actually learn to automate the classification or feed that information in. And then basically it will apply a specific label. So in this case, we could feed it training label and say, look, sensitivity level, and then match that over on our sensitivity level. So you can give it a whole bunch of documents, label them with that sensitivity training, and it'll go ahead and learn that and start applying that automatically. So this basically kind of covers your core use case for setting up any sort of labeling or kind of identifying internal documents and the internal sharing controls that are available on that one.
Yeah, great. And we'll get into in a little bit why folks might need a little bit more than what's there. But if we kind of go back and sum up, so we talked about how to regulate sharing and then also how to establish that labeling system like you just mentioned. So why don't we wrap up this walkthrough with just talking about DLP a little bit. So I'm excited because Google Workspace DLP, which stands for Data Loss Prevention, is where our platform integrates a lot with Google natively. So Shane, why don't you wrap us up there?
Getting into our home stretch with Google stuff here on our core here. So we talked about that the sensitivity labeling system, that cool AI mechanism is there if you've got kind of top level licensing and all that to help you out with this on a kind of an automated basis. But if you don't, you probably still have available Google's DLP engine, which is a super powerful tool set in itself. So you'll see here once I go into under security, access and data control, and then data protection, I'm looking at my data protection insights for Drive. Now, these are all built in. These run kind of on a weekly basis, and it gives you kind of a high level understanding of what's going on. So right now, you'll see that we've got, credit card numbers, email address, bank account numbers, all these sort of stuff that's just built-in tools from Google, and we get a little bit of an index on what's going on that one. But where we really want to go here is our data protection rules and detectors. So if I hit manage, you're going to see here that I skip down to some of the ones that we haven't created. You're going to find a lot of defaults in here. Now, these are built in, created by Google tools. And if I click on one of these, you're going to get to see that we're matching content type as Canadian passports. It's not currently alerting. It's going to give a warning when it detects this if somebody tries to share it, but really kind of a soft mode tool that's out there. But we can't do much with this particular rule. So these are all just built in defaults to help you out. What we want to do here is add a rule. And I'm going to create a new rule from template just because we're speed running this a little bit here. And we're going to create a PII information sharing template. So if I click that one, you'll see it fills in all the information for me. Again, we have the availability to set this on a per OU basis, a groups basis, etc. there. So we can dial in exactly who we want to impact with this rule. For our use cases in this demo here, we're going to narrow this a little bit. I don't necessarily need to use this rule to pull anything from chat or Gmail, but they are available and you can use the same rule sets to do that. So it can help streamline that process. But we're looking at content in Drive for this use case. So we're going to hit continue. And then within here, just at a high level, we're going to pick what type of content we're going to scan. So all content, body, classification, label, or file encryption status. Remember how I was talking about that classification level? So we can use that tool to go ahead and apply that as a factor for our DLP rules or other elements, which we'll talk about in a second. And then file encryption status is, of course, another one. We have our multiple content types. We've got matches words from word list, matches regex, contains text string, and then matches predefined data types. So word lists are kind of fun. I got to work with some media companies who put all their character names in there so that they couldn't leak any sort of scripts or anything that actually said who everybody was. So that was a lot of fun. In this case, we're matching predefined. So these are all Google AI kind of ML backend fed items there that you're going to commonly be looking for inside of this. So right now it's set to social security card number, but if I spin my wheel of destiny here, I get a Mexican passport, I get a global phone number, and I get a German taxpayer identification number. So there's a lot of things in here that are built in that you can go ahead and trigger off of. And then from there, you get to choose your weight or confidence in that hit. So going from very low confidence of a hit, meaning you want to catch everything, or very high in this. So this rule set's gone ahead and pre-populated a lot of the common US PII stuff. So individual taxpayer numbers, VIN numbers, all this sort of stuff that would be covered under a PII rule set. And hit continue one more time. I'm going to start at the bottom here. We're going to look at alerting. So alerting feeds into the alert center. If there's anything that triggers or maps to this particular rule, we're going to get a flag on that if we turn that on, and then we get to set what sensitivity that is. But this is all built into Google's alert center there. So that's all kind of with that. What we can do on the action front, we've got, again, some options. So right there, it's going to default to block external sharing. DLP on Google is super cool because it's super lightning fast. It's happening basically sub-millisecond. So as you paste that credit card number or that social security card number into that document, Google's going to sense that, detect it, and then retract the sharing externally on that document before that share update goes to everybody else who's on that document. So even if you have a live window with people you're trying to exfil data to and you're going to paste it in there and hopefully they can grab it before anything happens, no, it will catch it before that. But if we open this menu, we've got the ability to switch that from block to warn. So we get a little caution and let a user click through if there's, some things where we're getting a little bit of a higher rate of incorrect hit there. We can disable download, print, and copy. So if a user has view access on that content and we detect some sensitive material in there, that's going to just make it so that they can't export it from our Google tenancy any there. Or this last one, and I think you're kind of figuring out where I'm leading with this one, is apply classification labels. So we can use DLP here to go ahead and apply those labels that we have. So in this case, we're say AvePoint sensitivity. I've got my label field, which is sensitivity level, and I'm going to go ahead and pick medium because this is a PII rule. So it's probably on the sensitive side of things, but maybe not peak sensitivity where it's, super, super leak heavy there. And then we get to choose whether or not a user can change that label that's applied by the DLP engine. So in this case, we would probably want to force that. And if we set up our label properly in the earlier, we also made it so that the user cannot even see that this label is being applied. We can opt whether or not we want to do that, but in this case, maybe we want to do this completely silently on the back end so they're not aware of what's going on there. So with this, we get a quick summary page, and that kind of runs down the whole situation of what we're about to apply and how we're going to start to impact our users with that situation there.
All right. Well, that was great walking through all the rules you can set, the actions you can take. So why don't we talk a little bit more about the investigation side, right? If I want to report on this data, act on it, what does retention look like for these tools?
For sure. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and back myself up a little bit in the admin console here out of my DLP, and I'm going to go ahead and look at my reporting section now. So under reporting, if I go to my audit and investigation tool, we're going to look at my drive events. So in this case, we're down here with drive log events. Clicking this now moves into the drive investigation tool. Or I'm sorry, just the investigation tool, subset drive configuration. You'll see that we get drive log events is what we're filtering on. We can add conditions as we see fit if we want to narrow this to specific users or specific date ranges or all this. So it's very helpful in identifying and digging through that sort of data. But what we've got here is what we're trying to show is that we've got a list of basically everything that's going on inside of our Google tenant. And on all of these, we get an option to go ahead and take specific actions on documents based on drive or log events that we find. So we can manually apply that download, copy, print, and download function. We can remove users, we can change ownerships, we can audit file permissions and such there. We can also do this somewhat on a bulk basis. So if I go ahead and switch this to 300 rows, you'll see this switches from 1 to 300 of many results. I click that, and I get the ability to go ahead and audit file permissions. So I can expand that a little bit and say results on our pages. That's going to take a while to go ahead and expand to that. So we're going to narrow this to change to audit file permissions for just 300. Now within this, you're going to see here that we get the ability to see what's going on a per file basis, though not log entry basis, per file. So we had 300 log entries that we're looking at. We probably don't have 300 files because each one of those log entries is probably multiple on a single file as we're reviewing it there. But we can go ahead and start to do things like bulk changing permissions on this one. As again, so access, we can set access, again, do the same DLP there. So we can apply that. We can also view this from a people side of things where we're looking at this top down as a user front. So in this case, Shane, or we got Alec here, and we can see exactly what his permissions are on each individual file. Shared drives that are involved with this. So an M&A strategy, again, people who are involved with this internal and external basis, and then any sort of link sharing that we have here. So we do have the ability to go ahead and make these sort of permissions changes throughout our tenancy. But there is kind of one restriction that we run into here when we're using this drive audit tool. And that is the retention period. The retention period on the drive audit tool set is 180 days. So if you do not have an event on a file that has happened within the last 180 days to be included in that drive audit tool set, you can't use that tool set there, the investigation tool, to apply any of these mentioned changes. So if nobody's been touching, if we've got data that's pretty cold here, that's been around a long time, Google Drive's been around since 2012. So you've got, 12, 13 years of content out there potentially on your drive that may not have been touched, but is now still has the same kind of overarching sharing permission there. This tool doesn't really have the capability to go back in time and help you clean up that sort of situation where we can take these sort of top-down control changes here. So this is where we run into a little bit of a challenge there, working with the built-in tools that Google makes available on that one.
Right. Well, that was a great walkthrough, and especially talking about some of the limitations that we find a lot of our customers running into. So to kind of sum up everything that Shane just walked us through on the native side, there's tons of stuff within Google's DLP, the rules you can set, all these controls that basically kind of sit as like a boundary around, this data, all this unstructured data that we talked about, right? Files, drives, links that are getting shared, who has access to what, right? And again, we talked about how Gemini only surfaces what people have access to. So Gemini follows these controls. But, are organizations, 100% confident that the controls they have in place are set up correctly? How do they know of controls that were once misconfigured and left untouched for years, right? Or in the case of the example that we gave of an employee that changed departments and those permissions were never audited. Like Shane mentioned, retention being only 180 days, we find a lot of these organizations run into some of these limitations. So where AvePoint Confidence Platform integrates with Google natively is kind of building on top of that, so we can help companies anticipate data problems before they become an issue, before we even have to get to that investigation and audit stage, right? Let's set up proactive governance. Let's prioritize business and risk exposure. And when we talk about prioritizing risk, what our confidence platform really looks at from the data landscape is how are we blending exposure and sensitivity, right? If we have a sensitive document, that might be okay if it's only shared with 2 or 3 people on the team that need access to it. But what if that sensitive document is overexposed? It has a share with anyone link. So there's a blend of that context. Maybe there's a document that's shared with the whole company. We don't want to flag that as risk because maybe it's the benefits package that everyone in the company needs access to. So risk is all about understanding the business context behind it, and then prioritizing it so you know how to mitigate it. And then when we talk about being more proactive, right, not always being in that reactive state, even though sometimes we are, right, when we create a unified framework over that data, and even if it's multi-cloud too, right, what are the policies and how are you managing your workspaces, whether that data lives in Google in the instance that we're talking about, or maybe, your organization's also working in Microsoft or Salesforce or any of the other clouds, right? How do we make sure that we're managing workspaces so that data isn't left exposed in the first place? And then lastly, kind of talking about granular lifecycle controls, Shane mentioned the label manager and all the classification you can do in-house, but we find a lot of organizations when they're controlling tons and tons of data from creation to deletion and sometimes archival, it's really tough to make sure that you're staying compliant, but also making sure that that data is clean and safe to use for AI, right? Gemini and any other AI tool is only as good as the data that fuels it. So why is all of this important, right? Because when we talk about fueling better results for AI, and we're also talking about mitigating risk, sometimes that risk isn't always as obvious as we think it is. So it's interesting because we always think of cyber attacks and these sophisticated crimes, some hacker in a dark room halfway across the world. But what we're actually finding now in the landscape is that a lot of these threats actually aren't the biggest vulnerability to our unstructured data, right? The bigger concern is internally, and Google natively, we don't touch on it in this webinar specifically, but their secure by design infrastructure is already protecting that outside boundary, and some of the external sharing controls that are built in natively that Shane walked us through are helping the external side. But when we're talking about these internal risks, 80%, that's a pretty staggering figure, and again forces IT and security leaders to think differently when we're in the AI era. And in the context of the story that we told before of information oversharing, right? Accidental overexposure, sensitive information that an employee should have never had access to in the first place, but misconfigurations happen, right? But it's interesting. So when we talk to customers and you read all these stories out there of data overexposure, if you run into it in your own company, how do you even know that it's happening? How is that overexposure getting tracked back? Unfortunately, what we find in a lot of organizations that we work with is that they don't report on security issues until it becomes an issue, right? Until a sensitive document gets overshared, and then it gets shared with tens of people and hundreds of people, and it becomes a larger data breach. So this goes back to why our platform is really laser focused on helping companies anticipate these risks before they become a data breach, right? So let's shift back to a demo again. Shane's going to walk us through, our confidence platform, an area of the platform specifically that helps folks flag some of these risks before they become issues.
Thanks again, Ava. So we're right now looking at our risks and remediation section of the AvePoint platform here, specifically around Google Drive. So we're going to here. And now this is just kind of my welcome page. This is my at a glance. Everything that I kind of want to maybe be worried about here is surfaced really quickly and really smoothly. Now we're only looking at 7 days of data. I want to go ahead and bump that up to 6 months, just so that I get a little bit better view of what's going on in a trend-wise there. So, you might see a big spike in a 7-day data set. Something's really wrong. But if certain things are trending in the wrong direction for a long-term project, this is much more helpful on that sort of front. I also get notifications on things like direct access sharing, so external users, anyone, and target audience usage, as well as external users with the most permission. So right now, Alex 3 times over is our bad guy in this particular tenant here. So no offense, Alex, I love you, but maybe you've got a little too much access in our particular demo here. Looking at where I want to kind of go for here is our overall risk matrix. So this is a really, really simple thing that kind of gives you the biggest things that you probably want to hit first. So on the left side, we've got exposure. So obviously the lower exposure and the higher exposure. And then on the y-axis there, the x-axis there, we have our sensitivity. So we've got, low exposure, low sensitivity, 71 particular items in our tenant there. Probably stuff that I don't need to worry about too much. It's all kind of where we're going to go. We do have some sensitive items throughout our tenant there though, but it's low exposed, so we don't have to worry about it too much, in that we've got pretty narrow audiences that are participating and accessing that content. Still something probably worth looking into there. But the big one here that we have is that we're right here, we got a high exposure, high sensitivity item. So that probably needs to be addressed much sooner than later. So I'm just going to click that, and it's going to go ahead and pull up my risk analysis, pull my detailed records, and give me the information of what I'm looking at here. So we've got a object type is a file. If I mouse over it, it's meeting notes 0507 doc. It's created and owned by Alex. So it's created by him. It lives in his drive, so it's not in a shared drive right now. It's currently a high risk level, a high sensitivity level, and a high exposure level. This is how we got to this whole sort of situation here. So let's take a look at that document and see what we can do about that one. So I'm going to go ahead. You'll see that we got a lot of options to deal with right there on the front end, where we can go ahead and make those changes right there. But we're going to dive into detailed information. And at a glance, I get a high level here of external users 2, sharing links 1, and I get a summary in that. We're going to come back to that in just a second. I want to take a look at the details so I get a little more context about what's going on with this particular document. So again, I know that it's in Alex My Drive. It's this meeting notes doc. It's got a high risk and a high exposure. What exposure rule triggered that? Well, it's shared directly with those 2 external users, and anyone with a link fed that exposure rule. That's what gave it that level of exposure. That's caution there. If I look at the activities, This is going to look a little familiar as we just walked through the investigation tool, as we've got a very similar sort of answer here that we can go ahead and review the activities in a similar fashion. And similarly, we have our filtration capabilities. So I can narrow by people, I can see activities if I want to go and say, look for access request changes or ACLs that have changed elements there. I can go ahead and narrow that if I'm looking for specific things, a drive event, etc., where things were a little unwanted there. But in this case, we just want to deal with this clear permissions problem that we've got here. So right at the top, I've got my anyone with a link has been given edit access. That's a really wide sweeping permission. I don't like that for anything inside my organization. So for that one, I could just really quickly go ahead and say remove permission. I could also do that a little bit in bulk if I want to go ahead and remove permission, or maybe it is supposed to be accessible by everybody, but edit is just the wrong permission for that everyone access. So in this case, maybe we just want to bump it down to viewer role where we're going to go ahead and restrict that access to change that content. So that'll go ahead and change that. Now, for other users here, we've got our external users who Ava's got edit access as an external user. And then we've got Alex, it looks like he shared it with his other account, so his personal account maybe, or Gmail account. That's not great. So what we can do with that is, of course, we can start to do bulk edits here. And we could, again, edit those permissions. We can change what level they have or completely revoke those. But there's another cool feature here that we can do, which is just set the expiration time. So maybe I want to say, I'm going to send out an email nastygram to these people and say, look, you got until August 15th at noon. And if you don't have it solved by then, these permissions are going to 100% fix themselves because I don't want to come back in here and have to recheck this one. So it really streamlines that process of resolving these potential permission problems. Otherwise, they send me an email back that says, no, we need that. Don't retract it. I can come in here and turn this off anyway. So super easy on that sort of front. Now, that's us looking at kind of the potential document here with a high risk situation there. Now, share with anyone is really kind of our biggest problem in a lot of these situations where we're looking at this sort of content. So not just the share with anyone from an external standpoint, but share with anybody from a global standpoint, because again, Gemini is getting access to anything that we're going to go ahead and feed that. So with this, I'm going to go ahead and go to my exposure section and I'm going to go to sharing links. If I hit that, you're going to see here that I get my anyone sharing links and my target audience sharing links are summarized here really quickly. So total documents that are shared with this. Sensitive items in this case are not triggered, but if we go ahead and see this, it's a little different here. You see that I got two columns here. I got an AvePoint ATS at gsuite.com and I got a demo.avepoint.com. Well, that's because we actually have two workspace tenants attached to this particular AvePoint platform use case here. So you'll see that we actually have two. So we've got demo and our AvePoint ATS. So if you've got multiple workspace tenants that you want to manage, we can go ahead and pair those up. And this is also the same kind of tenancy and platform that we use for our Microsoft side of things. So it's a little different interface for that, but we're doing some refinement on that. So you could potentially be looking at across multiple platforms with this. But in this case, we're looking at Google. So we're looking at, in our case, anyone with link situation. And you'll see here that I can hit my total with link. It's going to spin for just a second here. And it's going to pull up, once again, we've got that meeting notes doc that's still sticking out there, but I've also got an employee performance review from 2023 and a confidentiality agreement. So in this case, the sensitivity level is a little lower. We'll talk about what gets into that, but if I want to go ahead and start making, say, bulk actions against things that are shared with anybody and are highly sensitive, once again, we can just go ahead and filter this and we can say sensitivity level, and I just want to see high, and then I could go ahead and check that and revoke access to documents that are high sensitivity and shared with anybody very, very quickly to get that really big sweeping cleanup really quickly done. So you can get those kind of easy, quick wins on that one. So with that, we need to talk about kind of what goes into this whole sensitivity label thing that we're talking about, because this is high sensitivity. Well, the answer to that is you would create a risk definition profile for your organization. So we're going to take a look at one here. We've got AvePoint demo tenant. And I'm just going to edit that one for the sake of time. We're going to hit next on that. And in this case, first off, we need our sensitivity definitions. Now, remember how I was just showing you about how Google Drive can go ahead and apply those labels using the DLP engine or their cool AI backend thing to go ahead and recognize certain document types and then apply labels as you see fit? Well, we're using that. We've gone ahead and we have built out these DLP-based sensitivity labels that we're pulling this label content here from Google, and we're syncing it into our platform as we scan everything. And then we're going to go ahead and use that to apply our high sensitivity. So in this case, we've matched it with our label for high, but we could also add other things from that where we could pull our training label set in there. We can have our departmental labels if we want to do that. We can change this to say finance or legal. So anything coming out of legal is just instantly high sensitivity. We've got our medium sensitivity where we can do the same thing. Again, just changing what label sets we're using. And then low sensitivity can kind of be a catch-all, or we can define different items there on that. So we've got our sensitivity labels coming from Google, doing that rapid scanning, looking for everything on the entire tenant there. But after that, we want to take a look at our exposure definitions. Now, this is where we're going to start to differ a little bit more again here. So right here, we've got our high exposure set for this right now, which is shared directly with external users. We get that inventory. We can say, look, if you got under 5 users, it's not a high risk situation. Maybe it would be a medium exposure level or elements with that. But we can also go ahead and apply a shared with link, shared with target audience via link, so that internal versus external difference there a little bit. So if you've got those narrow use cases, those could still be considered maybe now a medium exposure. And then the big one here is shared directly with multiple users and groups. So this would be where we're starting to look at how exposed things are internal to your organization. How many people inside your org have access to this, even if it's shared specifically with individual users or groups and not necessarily this big wide anyone with link. Because if I've got 1,000 users on this particular document through the groups and such, it's still really widely shared. I still want to control that, right? So I can use all this. This feeds into my risk definition profile. I can customize this for different subsets of users, tenants, etc., and then narrow that down. And then that gives me that whole profile that allows me to really quickly start to take actions and clean up that environment for what that is. And then all of this, that whole 180-day limit, we don't have that. We're scanning your Drive content as it lives right now. We're refreshing that on a regular basis. So anything that we're pulling this information based on is based off the current status of your content, not a log entry from 3 months ago that we happened to catch as it went by. So this is huge in cleaning up those Google Drive tenants that have been around for a long time, like I mentioned there. So.
Yeah. That's great. And I think you really encompassed, especially that internal security story that we've been talking about. So as we kind of get towards the end of our webinar, let's wrap up a little bit of the demo portion. So what we kind of talked about so far was why the importance needs to be on unstructured data, right? And why it's now more mission critical than ever, because this is the lifeblood of all of our AI initiatives, right? And then we just talked about the internal security threats and how you can take more actions, get that more granularity, more visibility and control is where platform's been extending that. And then lastly, feel like we have to say this, but it's not an AI problem that these customers are facing, it's a data problem, right? Especially in these larger organizations that have been around for tons of years and they haven't been monitoring these sharing permissions. AI is just exposing what's already been living there, right? So as we start to kind of wrap up, and we can't have an AI webinar about Gemini without talking about the future of agents, right? So where we're seeing, technology trending towards agents, it's incredible because it's not just, automating, tasks by saying like, oh, I'm going to set this prompt to clean up my inbox every day or just to, summarize it for me. What folks are doing with agents, they're actually redefining business processes. So there's tons of expansion that we're seeing and really excited to see where agentic AI goes. And especially as the rise of agentic AI comes, Google's response is agent space, right? So I was at Google Cloud Next back in April, and I was just really astonished by what they were doing with agent space and kind of the story that, data's become more siloed than ever, which is interesting because when we were back, years ago, everyone was on-prem in the legacy on-prem days, there were natural data silos, fragmented data that everyone was moving to the cloud to get away from that, right? They wanted to put all their data together, take out those data silos. But what's interesting is that as organizations expand to multi-cloud, data becomes siloed again. So what Google wants to do is be that platform that brings it all together. So these are just a few of the integrations that we pulled on Agent Space, but if you guys haven't looked into it, really suggest it because there's tons more integrations that they offer. But what's great about this too is that AvePoint supports a lot of these sources already, right? We're adding more sources to our platform every day. And where we've been really able to help a lot of our customers is create that unified framework across multiple clouds. So check out our blog as well on our own multi-cloud data journey, AI journey. And I mentioned at the beginning of the webinar how our own organization has been adopting Gemini, in addition with other tools like Microsoft Copilot. We also have a homegrown AI tool in there as well. So take a look. And if you want to get involved after this webinar, if you're passionate about data security, our product team has feedback forums where we lead monthly focus groups. So, scan that QR code if you're interested. And if you want to see more in action, Shane only demoed a portion of our platform today. There's tons more that we can show you, and you can actually get a free risk scan of your entire environment. So encourage folks if they're interested in that, and then also stay plugged into our webinars. We're going to have more of a webinar series. Like we mentioned, we only talked about a few topics today. There's only so much time, but thanks for joining us, and hope we answered all of your questions in the chat. But thanks so much, and have a great rest of your afternoons or mornings, wherever you are. Thank you.
Thank you.